Well, look, I think it's consistent with what we've been saying over the course of weeks now, if not months. The drug, there is data to suggest that the drug's active. It's not a home run. It's not a cure for the virus, but it's a drug that looks active against the virus, and if used appropriately, probably can benefit a certain percentage of patients. I think the proper role for this drug is going to be early in the course of the disease. So you'll probably hang it in the emergency room when people first arrive with COVID, suffering from symptoms of the virus itself. And it's probably going to be more effective in patients who have comorbidities that predict that they're more likely to have a bad outcome from COVID-19. And so I think used appropriately in higher risk patients early in the course of their disease, this could have a treatment effect that could be meaningful.
Meg mentioned the challenge of producing enough of it. Can we do that?
Well, the company is supply constrained. It's a complex manufacturing process. They've brought on contract manufacturers to try to ramp up supply. They've talked about having up to 1 million treatment courses by the end of the year, and maybe 400,000 as early as the fall. Hopefully it's going to be enough. This drug probably isn't for everyone. It's going to be for hospitalized patients. It needs to be delivered intravenously. It's probably going to be used, at least initially, in patients who have more significant disease or patients who are more likely to suffer an adverse outcome from COVID-19. So it's not going to be used probably initially in people who are otherwise healthy and more likely to do well with the virus. I think given that use pattern, we probably have enough doses to take us into the fall and deal with what's likely to be outbreaks of this infection in the fall. Remember, this isn't the last word on drugs. We're likely to have other products coming to the market, particularly those antibody drugs that we've talked about. I think coupled with those other therapies, this can be an important step forward and part of an overall toolbox that can reduce the risk of this infection.
What else needs to be in the toolbox?
We need very robust screening, which we're going to have in the fall. We're ramping up the ability to test people for this virus very quickly. I think by June, we'll have substantial capacity to do testing. We'll need capacity to do contact tracing, so when people are infected, try to trace people who they might have been in contact with and offer them the opportunity to be tested so that we can track and trace and try to contain spread. And in one or more therapeutics, I think Remdesivir coupled with one of those antibody drugs that could be used as both a treatment in early infection and a prophylaxis to prevent people from getting infected in the first place, that's a pretty robust toolbox. That's a toolbox that can help reduce the risk. It's not going to cure the virus. We're still going to face risk from it. But what we're looking to do is to try to mitigate the risk of this virus and reduce bad outcomes, reduce hospitalizations and ICU admissions until we get to a vaccine. These are early days. I can't remember a virus where the first generation antiviral that we came up with to target a virus was a slam dunk home run. With every virus, the first generation of drugs were not that good. And then second and third generation drugs came along. I think the innovation in this space, given all the intense focus of the biopharmaceutical industry, is going to be pretty quick.
Can you speak to the fact about what Dr. Fauci was talking about today in the Oval Office about the fact that this study was stopped early because of what he called ethical obligation to tell those in the placebo group and then have access for them to this treatment?
Right, that's not unusual. There's interim looks in trials, and when you see that the active arm is having a robust treatment effect and having better outcomes, you want to allow the patients in the placebo group, the patients who are receiving an inert drug, to cross over to the active arm and receive the therapy. And at some point when you know that a drug's working in a setting like this where people are suffering very bad outcomes, you want to make the treatment more broadly available. And if the FDA issues an emergency use authorization, which would authorize this drug to be distributed through commercial channels, that's going to make broader availability of this treatment in the setting of the epidemic. The epidemic is in its decline, thankfully. Hopefully into next month, we'll see a sharp reduction in the number of cases. But there are still people suffering from this virus and still people presenting with virus, with infection, that are at risk of bad outcomes and maybe could be benefiting from Remdesivir. So I think it's going to be made more broadly available. Remember also, there were open-label studies alongside this randomized placebo-controlled trial. And so a lot of people were getting access to the drug in the context of those open-label studies.
Let's talk about now what you've called the race to a vaccine. Interesting story today that the administration has a program called Operation Warp Speed to fast-track the approval and the production of a vaccine, able to give as many as 300 million doses by January. What do we know?
Well, it's not clear what the administration is going to stand up. I think that what is clear is that there is an intense focus on trying to bring together a more coordinated process to try to get to a vaccine quickly and solve the biggest challenge, which is going to be the commercial scale-up of manufacturing. That's someplace where the government can play an important role. The manufacturers of biopharmaceutical companies are working on a number of different vaccines. There's a lot of companies working on this now and a lot of U.S. domiciled companies working on it. I think we're going to have a successful product, hopefully by the fall, a product that's cleared preliminary safety studies and is entering pivotal studies. What's going to be more challenging is scaling up the manufacturing and getting to the hundreds of millions of doses you need, not just to mass inoculate the U.S. population, but also provide it globally. And remember, this is a vaccine that's going to be used very broadly, so we're going to want to have a very large safety database for this vaccine. This is going to be trialed probably in tens of thousands of patients so that we have enough clinical data to give us confidence that it's not just working, but that it's safe for use in a very broad population.
They're talking about what they call, quote, a master protocol, which I'm hoping you can shed some light on. And maybe that's what you're speaking on right now, rather than this traditional clinical trial that we've become used to.
Well, what a master protocol basically is it's one big trial, and you enroll, tens of thousands of patients into a single trial, and then you randomize the patients to receive the different therapies, in this case, the different vaccines. I think what would happen is if we had an outbreak of COVID-19 in a major American city, and I think, unfortunately, we're going to be facing this prospect in the fall, what you would do is randomize people to receive the vaccine at different intervals. So you might, on day one, randomize 25,000 people to receive a vaccine, and then 2 weeks later, enroll another 25,000 patients to receive the vaccine, and then 2 weeks after that, another 25,000 patients. And what you would do is look at the 3 different treatment arms and see if the time of inoculation had an impact on people's propensity to get the infection. So that's one kind of clinical trial that you can roll out in the setting of an outbreak. So you're using the vaccine not just in a way that you're testing it to see if it works and if it's in fact safe and effective, but you're also using it as a potential treatment to ring-fence an outbreak. And if these vaccines clear preliminary safety studies, which they're in right now, you'll be in a position to do that in the fall. And some of the manufacturers have already said they'll have enough doses, they'll have millions of doses available to use the vaccine to deploy it in that way.
Does it carry more risk than your typical clinical trial?
I don't think it carries more risk in terms of the structure of the clinical trial. I think these vaccines carry more risk only insofar as there's more uncertainty around them. We've never developed a vaccine to a coronavirus before, and the kinds of platforms that are being used to target this coronavirus, the vaccine platforms that we're using, either the mRNA vaccines or the protein vaccines or DNA vaccines or adenoviral vector vaccines, those are the major platforms. We typically haven't used those platforms to make vaccines in the past. Vaccines have been made through very old-fashioned ways. Our approaches to making vaccines haven't changed in many years in many cases. So we're using newer technology here, and that brings more uncertainty. Now, that said, some of these platforms have been used already, so we do have some experience with them in certain viruses, including the Ebola vaccine. The Ebola vaccine was also developed using a novel vaccine platform.
Let's not forget, we were talking about a timeline 12 to 18 months in the early days of this outbreak. Does it sound realistic to you that we could really produce 300 million doses to be given by January?
I think that's ambitious. I think that we could have hundreds of millions of doses into next year, into 2021. But, if you're looking across all the manufacturers and you aggregate all the supply that they're capable of bringing on the market, it could be substantial. Remember, there's some very big companies involved in this, including the company that I serve on the board of, Pfizer. And so if all those companies were each to produce the vaccines in significant quantities, and a lot of them have committed to do that at risk, I think you could have a lot of vaccine available across all the different vaccine platforms that are in development. The hope here is that we have more than one vaccine. We really need multiple manufacturers to be successful here.
Another interesting factor here is that taxpayers would apparently fund this, which would ease the burden on drug companies like Pfizer, in which you do serve on the board. That would be critical, especially if things didn't work out, right?
Well, some of the money from the government has already supported some of the development. So J&J received money from BARDA to help support some of the manufacturing. The companies are doing a lot of this at risk. They put up their own money. But certainly if the government steps in, and they will, the money's been allocated by Congress and been appropriated for this, the government steps in to guarantee purchase of certain amounts of vaccine. That's going to make it easier to make the substantial capital investments in new manufacturing facilities that you're going to need. So there is going to be substantial government support here for all the companies that are involved in this, all of them.
All right, let's move from science to plans to reopen the country in certain ways. Simon Property Group, one of the largest mall operators in this country, plans to open 49 malls in 10 states by Monday. Is that a good idea?
Well, look, it depends on the states, and it depends on what they're going to be doing in terms of opening those retail sites. The reality is that there's 25 states where the number of cases of coronavirus are still increasing on a daily basis. There's really only 5 or 6 states that meet the criteria set out by the White House in terms of sustained reduction in new cases that they can safely reopen. And so you need to look state by state. Certain states, I think, are in much better shape than others. Certainly when you look at the hard-hit states like the Northeast, or states like Louisiana or Florida or Georgia, those are harder hit states where they had bigger epidemics, and they need to be more cautious about reopening. I think the risk here isn't necessarily that we get a resurgent epidemic in the summer. The risk is that we never get rid of the virus and we have smoldering infections. We still have thousands of cases on a daily basis all through the summer. And then when we enter the fall, then we get a combustion of those cases and the risk of another epidemic or certainly large outbreaks. So we really need to try to snuff this out.
Does it concern you at all in light of what you're just mentioning here? Starbucks today, the CEO on this network, said the company plans to open more than 90% of its stores, at least for mobile ordering, by June. Are you on board with decisions like that?
Well, Starbucks in a lot of states has still been open. Here in my state, in Connecticut, you can still drive up and get coffee from Starbucks. And so they've been doing that. I think Starbucks has actually taken steps to try to reduce risk in their establishments, and it's been a good corporate citizen. They were one of the first to implement measures in their stores, even before we started to shut down retail locations in this country to try to reduce risk. For example, not allowing people to bring in mugs to be refilled, so you reduce the risk that you can get transfer of infection from barristers touching mugs that get brought in and then touching other people's mugs. So I think they've thought very carefully about this, and I would defer to the company. I think that they have been thoughtful.